Tonight, we're talking about the American Revolution and welcoming for the first time at People's University, Professor of History at West Liberty University, Dr. Richard Owens. I think better when I'm pacing. I did circulate some pieces of paper. I know I didn't have enough to go around, and I'm sorry for that, so perhaps you can share with your friend, spouse, whoever you're with. But I did want you to know about one of my two brand new books. The history that just came out, actually it's coming out in a couple of weeks, is called Rogue State. It's about West Virginia statehood, and this is an historical novel, as the subtitle suggests, set in the United States in 1940. It's called Atonement, and while I was writing it over those many, many months, my wife kept saying, "When are you going to finish?" And I already written the end. I always write the end before I write the middle, but I said to her, and this was the truth, I don't want to finish. I'm having too good a time writing. But I finally did, and there it is, all 630 pages of it. So if you're interested in World War II, if you're interested in America in 1940, if you are interested in Washington, D.C., or any of the related subjects, I recommend them to you. Tonight I'm going to talk about the American Revolution, and my approach with all of my teaching is to try to give the macro view. Now, I've done Civil War programs with some brilliant people who are reenactors, and they can tell you whether a button on a uniform is authentic or a copy. I don't know. I try to look at the bigger issues. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The issues, the major themes, the key characters. And I'll throw in a piece of trivia every now and then. But again, think of this approach as the macro approach. So you have the big view. It's kind of like looking at the Earth from a spaceship, as opposed to walking through the streets of every single town on the planet. And hopefully that will be all right. I did have one request for a coverage of a particular topic. We'll hopefully try to get to that. So let me start out with a macro view of the American Revolution, because it was not just a global war in which those American colonies engaged in the 1770s. It was also the start of a global movement of nationalist revolutions that are still underway in our world today. So this set the stage for some very powerful, important ideas and themes in human history, not just American history. Example, the idea that a people could rule themselves and not be ruled by a king or an emperor. Radical notion in 1776. The idea of establishing a republic. The idea that individuals have rights and freedoms not given from on high by the king was a radical notion. And it was a beautiful notion. And the proof is that it's worked. So we're going to look at the issues, the causes, the ideas, and then most importantly, in any discussion of history, we're going to look at some people. Because people is about us. It's history, it's her story, it's our story. That's what history is. So when we talk about these people, these amazing people who brought those colonies to the brink of revolution, saw them to independence, and achieved that independence, we're talking about people who had an impact not just on our lives, not just on America, but on the entire planet. Is this fading already? Are we okay? Hear me in the back? It's always hard to find a place to start. It's one of the hardest things on any topic. We're going to start at the end of what was called the Great War for Empire, also known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, best known in the American colonies as the French and Indian War. I happen to like movies. I think the best movie on the French and Indian War is the 1992 movie by Michael Mann, The Last of the Mohicans. If you've seen that, you got an image of what that time was like, what those places were like, and what some of the issues were like. At the end of that great war for empire, Britain had driven France out of North America, and a lot of people don't remember this, even took Florida briefly from Spain and consolidated its dominance over the eastern half of North America, leaving Spain west of the Mississippi. Forcing France out of North America was one of the elements that contributed to a change in British policy and in colonial perceptions. Perceptions are important. Ideas are important. It doesn't matter whether you know much about me. If you perceive something about me, then you're going to go with that perception. Americans began to perceive their relationship with their mother country in a different manner. Much more so than the British perceived Americans differently after 1763. The difference was in the way America saw its relationship with England. And the expulsion of France from North America was a key initial factor in that, because up until that time, with France and Canada, the colonists felt the need for British protection. They felt comfortable with British protection. But once the French were gone, kind of like teenagers when mom and dad had gone out to the movies, hey, we're on our own now. We don't need the rules. Another factor, after the Great War for Empire, the British Empire was broke, bankrupt. It needed money. And the most untaxed people in the British Empire were those American colonies. And they were the most prosperous people in the British Empire. And so the British sought to extend additional taxation to those American colonists. But that wasn't really what was going on. The taxation was more a symbol. What the British most importantly did after 1763 was change their way of dealing with the colonies. From 1607 and the establishment of Jamestown until the French and Indian War, the British generally had a hands-off policy toward the colonies, which we call salutary neglect, then officially leaving them alone to do their own thing. Why not? They were loyal members of the British Empire. The British king was their king, their sovereign. They called themselves, saw themselves as, and believed they were Englishmen, not Americans. They didn't use that term. The American colonies described the colonies, but they were Englishmen, and they were proud of it. As proud of being Englishmen then as we are being Americans today. Well, what changed was salutary neglect gave way to a greater need on Britain's part to control the commerce and the social and political affairs of the colonies. And the manifestation of that was, to a degree, increased taxation and new taxes. But there were other things. For example, this map shows in 1763 that the British drew a line down the crest of the Appalachians and proclaimed in the proclamation of 1763 that the colonists had to stay east of that line. The colonists' reaction in newspaper editorials, from pulpits, in taverns, on the street was, wait a minute, we helped fight against the French and against the Indians to get the French and get the Indians out of the way so we could expand into the Ohio Valley and beyond. Nice land, this Ohio Valley. We know it, and they knew it. But the proclamation line banned the colonists from crossing. the Appalachians into these new lands, these fertile lands, these bountiful lands, these free lands. So there were a number of things at the outset. And then what happened essentially was, you know that movie Cool Hand Luke? What we have here is a failure to communicate. It was a failure of understanding as well as communication. When the colonists talked about freedom, they meant the freedom to have things the way they had been and to basically govern themselves, especially in the matter of taxation. The British notion of freedom was you were free as a member of the British Empire to be a loyal subject of the British Empire. There were trade routes all around the world, and American traders and merchants took part in a global network of trade and commerce. They wanted to expand that as well as just maintain it. And they wanted to do it with as few restrictions as possible. But the more the British saw the financial need and the wealth of the colonies, the more they realized that they needed to try to control all of that they needed to try to rein in this American enterprise and initiative, not stifle it, but rein it in so that the Crown, the English government, could take care of its financial and political obligations. And indeed, Britain now had political obligations all over the world. We tend to think of the American Revolution as something that happened here, but as I said, it was a global war, as was the Great War for Empire. And in that Great War for Empire, England, among other places, conquered and acquired India and other colonies as well. So the British needs were far-flung. The British Empire was far-flung. And while the Americans tended to look only at those 13 English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, the folks in London were literally taking a global perspective on it. All of those factors at the outset of this period between 1763 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776 did not lead irrevocably to independence and revolution. There were lots of opportunities where people could have said, wait a minute, we need to get a better understanding of what the other side is thinking and doing here. How can we do that? How can we work out these challenges? How can we mend fences? Well, it didn't work out that way, as we know. In the process of reorganizing the empire and re-establishing the relationship between Crown and colonies, the British government clearly made mistakes. The biggest mistake, even before the colonies declared independence, was trying to deal with and solve the American problem with military means. If the British had kept the taxes and left the troops at home, we'd probably be speaking with English accents and singing God Save the Queen. Maybe not, but I think you might. Americans didn't want independence initially, but as we'll see, that's how it turned out. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the specifics, but there were, as you know and remember, a number of key developments in the 1760s and into the 1770s that added fuel to the fire. The Stamp Act was a tax basically on the business of doing business. And in 1765, the colonists reacted bitterly against this new tax. They never contested Britain's right to govern and control what they called navigation, commerce. But that was outside the boundaries of the colonies. Within the colonies, beginning with the House of Burgesses in 1619 in Virginia, these colonists had developed institutions for and a love of self-government. And they saw these parliamentary actions and these royal decrees as contrary to a century and a half of political evolution and a century and a half of freedom as they defined it. Now, in 1763, the freest people on the planet were the American colonists. They were essentially autonomous in almost every regard, except really in wartime and when it came time to paying duties on imports and exports. That was essentially it. But they were jealous of that status. They were aware of their unique privileges, and they didn't want to lose them. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, the next year, 1766, realizing it had struck a wrong chord in the colonies, Parliament didn't leave it at that. Parliament insisted on passing that same year something called the Declaratory Act, which essentially said, we've repealed the Stamp Act, but we retain the right to tax you when and how we please. The principle, from Britain's point of view, was Parliament governed and the King ruled. The Americans resented the Declaratory Act more than they resented the Stamp Act that preceded it. Because the Stamp Act was a tax where you had to buy a stamp and put it on a deck of cards, a newspaper, a legal document, a birth certificate, a business card, anything. Okay, it's a nuisance, it costs you some money. But the Declaratory Act said, in all matters, Parliament is supreme. No exceptions. No exceptions. Americans didn't like that. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, any number of duties, including the 1767 Townsend duties, these were all financial. But the principle was, who's calling the dance day? Parliament, England, the Crown, not the colonial legislatures. But nobody was talking about independence. They were instead talking about redressing these grievances, establishing the rights of Englishmen. Americans were undoubtedly, at that time, the most literate people on the planet. They read the classics, they certainly read and studied the Bible, but they've also read and studied modern treatises. Modern treatises on government, on law. They studied history, political science, economics. It's no accident that Adam Smith's famous Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. Many Americans tried to deal with these issues through established channels of communication. Newspapers, emissaries to Parliament. All colonies had agents. The most famous was Benjamin Franklin, who was not just Pennsylvania's agent, but served as agent for several colonies in London. But that wasn't getting it done. And some of these colonists decided that they needed to take their views and their positions to another level. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They were passionate about what they perceived as intrusion on their rights as Englishmen. They weren't talking about independence. They were talking about their liberties as Englishmen. The founders and members of the Sons of Liberty were a very disparate lot. Farmers, tradesmen, longshoremen, sailors, merchants, like the richest man in the colonies, John Hancock. And one, probably the most noted of the Sons of Liberty, a professional rabble-rouser named Sam Adams. It's the same guy that the beer is named for, but this Sam Adams, cousin of John Adams, loved nothing more than an argument. And if it spilled over into the street and a few people got their noses punched, that was even better. Adams reveled in that, but he was a true believer. He saw the actions of the British government as actions designed, intentionally or not, to undermine the liberties of the American colonists. In 1770, tensions rose markedly in the city of Boston. And the result was, unfortunately, in December of that year, an incident that is one of the many myths of the American Revolutionary period. Dr. Javersack going to talk about George Washington, man or myth? Yes, both. We'll talk about George in a little while. One of the myths of the American Revolution centers around the so-called Boston Massacre. It was started when a colonist threw a snowball or ice ball or some other hard object at a British soldier. Nobody ordered the British to open fire. It's probable that the first shot was accidental, but once that happened, everything broke loose, and in the end, a number of colonists were killed and wounded. Paul Revere, a master silversmith and engraver in Boston, well-to-do merchant and retailer, a member of the Sons of Liberty, dubbed it the Boston Massacre, and his famous etching, which was made into prints that appeared in newspapers and on broadsides all over the colonies, defined that event inaccurately but powerfully for the American colonists. It appeared to Revere, and the way he spun it, that the British had sent troops to Boston to oppress the citizens of Boston, not to protect them, and that the incident was an example of tyranny run amok, a violation of the most basic of human rights, the right to life. Revere and Adams and these Sons of Liberty were masters of propaganda. They were the spin artists of that era. They were good at it. The soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre were brought to trial. Trial by a jury of their peers, civilians. And they had one of the best lawyers in the colonies to defend them. His friends and most of his family thought he was crazy taking the job. He would ruin his reputation. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty, by the way. And he's going to defend those murdering lobsterbacks, as the British soldiers were called disparagingly by the colonists. John Adams said, they have a right to a fair trial and the right to the best defense we can give them. I'm going to do that. That may have been the gutsiest call of the American Revolution. John Adams could have ended up tarred, feathered, or worse, because the colonists did a whole lot worse to people for doing a whole lot less. Nevertheless, Adams defended them, and they were acquitted, except a couple who were convicted of some minor charges. Adams emerged, fortunately, as a hero. People recognized the principles for which he stood. And more than the myth of the Boston Massacre, I like to think that Adams' courageous stand underscored what the colonists were really trying to do. They were trying to establish principles. And of the principles that we believe very important in this country, the right to a fair trial is one of those. And he helped ensure that in the process of defending those British soldiers. Boston, though, remained a hotspot of Sons of Liberty activity and a pressure point for the British and for the American colonies. Boston was the most important city commercially at that time, more even than New York. Yet, as tensions continued in Boston, Parliament, the British Congress, Parliament passed another tax. In repealing the Townshend duties that had been so controversial, taxes on paint, lead, glass, paper, everything the colonists used, including tea, Parliament repealed all those, but kept the tax on tea just to prove a point. And the point was, we can tax you anytime we want to. The tax was a pittance. You wouldn't have even noticed it at the local store when you bought tea. It was a fraction of a cent a pound. The colonists also objected to an ulterior motive in that tea act tax, which many of the textbooks don't talk about. It gave an unfair advantage to the British East India Company, which was having financial difficulties, a company in which many members of Parliament owned stock. So the colonists were shrewd enough to realize that this was also, in addition to a small tax on them, in addition to an emphasis of the principle that Parliament ruled, it was also basically a corrupt deal, hatched in London, and they saw themselves as the victims of it. American colonists stopped drinking tea. How many of you like coffee? Thank the tea tax. They started to substitute coffee instead of tea. It was unpatriotic to buy tea. Well, the market for tea went right to the bottom. But the British needed to sell that tea. It was an important commodity in their worldwide exchange. And the East India Company sent several ships full of tea to Boston Harbor, where they thought it was going to be unloaded and sold. The problem was no one would unload it, and no one would pay the tax, because no one in Boston was going to buy that tea. There things stayed until in December of 1773, the Sons of Liberty got a really cool idea. They dressed up like Mohawk Indians. Nobody was fooled. They went aboard those ships. That's called trespassing. They forced the crew aside. That's called assault. They broke into the holds of the ships, dragged case after case after case of tea to the decks, smashed open the wooden cases, and dumped it into Boston Harbor. Well, that's destruction of property, theft, and a whole lot of other felonies. There was so much tea dumped in Boston Harbor that the fish in Boston Harbor are still high from the caffeine. You know what a tea bag weighs. You know what a box of tea weighs. Next to nothing. They dropped tons of tea into Boston Harbor, willingly and knowingly. As I said, dressing up like Mohawks didn't fool anybody. Everybody knew who these folks were. And it was no surprise to the citizens of Boston. Boston's population then was around 20,000. Let's just assume for a minute, roughly speaking, that there were 8,000 or 9,000 adults in that population. I don't know exactly, but just to pick a number. Sons of Liberty got the word out long before the Boston Tea Party that something was going to happen on the docks that night. There were 5,000 Bostonians watching the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty wanted everybody to know what they were doing and why. And I'm sure most of those Bostonians cheered. You wouldn't have been there if you didn't like the idea. It wasn't done in secret. They didn't creep aboard the dead of night in stealth and silence. It was a PR gesture. In a grand way. Think of the population of Wheeling being, what, 15,000 or so? Imagine an event in which 5,000 adults are down at the Heritage Port for a concert or to see a paddle wheeler within the port. It's going to be most of the adult population of town, isn't it? Boston Tea Party was quite a tea party. No tea was drunk. A lot of tea was destroyed. The British reacted, as you probably might expect. The reaction on the part of Britain was something called the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were so harsh that many couldn't believe it when they read them. One of them closed the port of Boston. That meant instant 20% unemployment and within weeks a virtual shutdown of the city. This was a commercial and shipping center. And if the port was shut down, the city was shut down. The British were going to make the Bostonians pay, literally, for the Tea Party. Britain went further. They shut down the Massachusetts General Assembly. Now, it met again in secret and in private, but officially, it was defunct. There were others as well. But those two, particularly, demonstrated to people in the other colonies that things were serious and that it might happen to them. Because if the government in London could close down Boston, it could close down Newport, or New York, or Philadelphia, or Wilmington, or Charleston, or Norfolk, or right down the coast. And if they could declare any act of the Massachusetts General Assembly null and void, and declare the Assembly closed until further notice, they could do that in New Hampshire, or Pennsylvania, or South Carolina, or any of the 13 colonies as well. It was at that time, rather than prior, that the 13 colonies and people in the 13 colonies began to see that they had some things in common, and a common threat and a common danger. Committees of correspondence grew up. Literally, not by tweeting or going on Facebook, but by sending letters and pamphlets. These people in the colonies started to communicate their ideas and their feelings and their opinions, and they found that they did have, in fact, a great deal in common. So much so that they called for a meeting to be held in Philadelphia in 1774, and they called it the Continental Congress. Why did they call it that? Why didn't they call it the American Congress? Well, one, they weren't really using the term American, but two, more importantly, they didn't just invite representatives of the 13 Atlantic seaboard British colonies. They also invited our Canadian friends to the north and British colonists in the Caribbean on British territories there to a Continental Congress representing the entire white English-speaking population of North America. Other Canadians and the Caribbean colonists decided not to come, but that's why it was called Continental. In fact, the Continental Army, which got its name from the Continental Congress, was also seen initially as a North American rather than just a British American colonial force. The first Continental Congress adjourned, but the next year, 1775, it reconvened as the Second Continental Congress. The topics of discussion remained how to get Britain to back off on its very harsh treatment of the New England colonies, especially Massachusetts. How to get the British to understand that these American colonists were true loyal subjects of King George III, true Englishmen. Many of them believed they were better Englishmen than the folks on the other side of the ocean. The folks on the other side had lost track of what it meant to be a free Englishman, what Magna Carta had stood for, what Parliament was supposed to mean. Those Continental Congresses worked to try to repair the differences between Britain and its North American colonists. Of course, we know to no avail, but it tried nonetheless. Among the efforts of that Continental Congress was something called an olive branch petition, which was sent to King George before the Declaration of Independence was authorized by Congress. And olive branches, of course, a gesture of peace. And it was a petition that basically said, we, your loyal subjects, implore you, our wonderful regal king, to look on this situation and change the wrongs and put us back on the path to right. King George refused to look at it. Up until that point, most Americans saw Parliament as the bad guys. They still thought the king was kind of going to swoop in and tell Parliament to back off and become their champion. They didn't realize that King George, whose empire it was very concerned about the financial and political state of this far-flung, wonderful to him British Empire. By 1776, the colonists had begun to see King George as a big problem as Parliament. In 1775, a number of developments occurred that really set the stage for revolution. This is a little different view of those colonies in that proclamation line. Many of the colonies had claims west of the Appalachians, but the proclamation line said don't go any further than this. And so consequently, pretty much everybody in the colonies felt cheated by that. Oops. I'm used to using a mouse, not the pad. One of the weapons the colonists used throughout this period was called non-importation. It's essentially a boycott, but they used the term non-importation. This chart shows how, through these various crises of the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the repeal of the Townshend Acts, but the imposition of the Intolerable Acts, and then the Tea Act of 1773, you can see how imports went up and then dramatically declined after that. It was a very effective weapon, but it wasn't the ultimate weapon. In fact, in one of my books, The Neutrality Imperative, I talk about how ineffective economic diplomacy has been throughout American history. It didn't work then either, but they tried everything they could without even taking the step to saying the word independence, just to try to get Parliament and the King to see things from the American perception. Again, to no avail. In 1775, in April of that year, the British, who were very worried about what was going on in the colonies, had, by that point, sent thousands of troops, mostly to the Boston area, to New England. And as you know, they got wind of Sons of Liberty activities, conspiracies, to amass firearms and powder and shot, ostensibly to stage a revolution. And so the British sent troops to what they thought was a cache of colonial arms in Concord, Massachusetts. And on the way, they went through Lexington, and you all know what happened there. April 19, 1775, more than a full year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. British troops and American troops clashed on Lexington Green, and the word went out. By the time the British troops met the American forces at Concord, they were outnumbered and began a long and bloody retreat back to Boston, about which one British officer said, any more retreats like that and we won't have much of an army left. Casualties were very high, especially by the standards of 1775. Those colonists literally came out of the woods and the woodwork. You know, they called themselves Minutemen because they were ready at a minute's notice to grab that musket off the fireplace, a weapon that was primarily used for hunting, and go out and attack those British soldiers. All the protests and all the non-importation and all the pamphlets and all the propaganda and all the tea parties wouldn't amount to a hill of beans compared to what happened at Lexington and Concord. The British saw it as an assault on their troops, on their flag, on their authority, on their right to govern the colonies. And from that point on, while efforts to reconcile continued, many Americans started to think of the relationship between the colonies and Britain in different terms. What kind of a benevolent king sends these murderous soldiers to our shores, quarters them without payment in our homes, raises taxes on us to pay for them, allows them free run of the streets, where they were in many cases rude to the colonial residents? What kind of a good king would do that? What kind of a man would do that? The word tyrant kept popping up, because to them that was a demonstration of tyranny. And it was the opposite of what they had come to see as the essential relationship with England and their rights as Englishmen. They continued to protest. They continued non-importation, but to no avail. Someone asked me to talk a little bit about the literature of 1776 and that era. I'm just going to mention three, as I promised them I would. All written by men named Tom. Two of them by the same Tom. Tom Paine's Common Sense and the American Crisis. And although he wasn't the sole author, we always credit Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence. I don't know of three more powerful pieces of literature in American history. Maybe you can throw Tom's Cabin and Potomac into the mix. Like, those three are among the top five. In January of 1776, Tom Paine became a game changer. Paine had recently arrived in America. He hadn't been terribly successful in England. Came to America, encouraged and kind of sponsored by a very prominent American, really the most prominent American of his age, Benjamin Franklin. Paine immediately got a sense of what was going on, and he saw it from a much deeper and further perspective than many of the colonists. Common sense was a plea to these well-read, intelligent, freedom-loving Americans. Use your common sense. Look at what's going on. Parliament and King have imposed a tyranny upon you that you neither want nor deserve. You have rights as Englishmen and as human beings that are being disregarded in London. And the culprit is that king who could step in any time he wanted to, but he doesn't because he wants to oppress you. It furthers his imperial ambitions. Common Sense was a pamphlet, a few pages long. You could read it in an hour. It was printed and circulated throughout the colonies. It was an instant hit. If people had actually sold it, it would have been a bestseller. But most of the time, it was printed and given away for cost. And if it wasn't read individually, it was read aloud at public meetings, on street corners, in taverns, in churches, everywhere. It's hard to imagine an adult living within 50 miles of a city or the coast in those American colonies who didn't hear about it or read or have read to him or her Common Sense. Paine's reaction, which caught on like wildfire, was, look, why are we trying to supplicate this king? He doesn't care about us. We should be independent. There's a word. They hadn't been using that before. They wanted to fix the marriage, not get a divorce. Paine demonstrated in legal terms that these were irreconcilable differences, the two most famous words in Hollywood. Now, in retrospect, we know he was right, but at the time, this was a bolt of lightning. Independent. Those two other pieces, the American Crisis, which appeared just about a year later, was a summons to Americans that if they wanted to be free, they had to earn it, even with their blood. He talked about sunshine patriots, people who talked about freedom but weren't willing to step up and be counted. And then, of course, we all know that the following June, a committee of the Second Continental Congress, led by Thomas Jefferson, but with a lot of editing from Benjamin Franklin, produced a document that is the most revolutionary document in the history of the human race, with the exception of the New Testament. And you can quote me on that. Love God and love one another is about as revolutionary as you can. But all men are created equal, that's right up there. Within literally just months, 150 years of a relationship was 70. Within just a few months, a substantial number of Americans came to believe that they would be better off, not just independent, but fighting a war for independence and then governing themselves. Boston Tea Party. Congress was acting in defense of the colonies even before it voted for the Declaration. Before the United States said it was an independent union of states, the Continental Congress established the Continental Army. Continental because they wanted it to include not just those 13 colonies, but also the Canadians and the Caribbean, subjects of the British Crown. And while they debated, they knew that one of the keys to that Continental Army's success was who was going to lead it. One of the delegates of the Second Continental Congress wanted the job very badly, but he was too proud to ask for the job. So without saying much, day after day after day, George Washington of Virginia sat quietly there in Philadelphia, wearing the uniform of a colonel of Virginia Volunteers, which was his rank. Advertising. I have the experience, I have the character, I have the skills, I have the temperament, and I have the desire to lead that army. But a little further. A Massachusetts man brought forth George Washington's name. He knew that for all the colonies to be united, that there had to be something more than just ideas. There had to be a tangible symbol of how and why the southern and middle colonies might want to help what then was perceived to a degree as New England's crisis with England. And that Massachusetts delegate, John Adams, nominated George Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army. George got the job. Take away all the myth and just look at the reality. I have a feeling Dr. Chaversack's going to expand on this theme. Washington was one heck of a great general, one heck of a great guy, and one heck of a great American. Did he have his flaws? Yes. Did he own slaves? Yes. Boo! But he freed them on his deathbed, which is more than Jefferson ever did. And Jefferson gets credited with all men are created equal. Adams liked Washington, and Adams took his full measure and said, this is the man who can do it if anybody can. Washington's record as a general in the Revolution was mixed. He lost some battles, he won a few. Usually, though, it wasn't really his fault. He was usually outnumbered and outgunned and outsupplied. The American Navy, I was in the Navy, so don't get me wrong, but the American Navy wasn't much because it was very small and very new. And the British Navy was only the most powerful Navy on the planet. No other two navies came close to the British Navy. But Washington brought some things to the table outside of his military experience and skills that were part and parcel of who George Washington was. And Adams picked up on it immediately. He didn't know Washington well, but he knew him well enough to know that he was a man of integrity, a man of perseverance, a man of courage, a leader, a patriot, and that there was no quit in George Washington. He was right. Washington immediately went to Boston, where the militias from several of the New England colonies had gathered outside of Boston with the British troops in the city. Washington took command. This was before the Declaration of Independence. Washington took command. And within a fairly short period of time, Washington and his leadership successfully forced the British out of Boston. But George didn't do it. An overweight book dealer from Boston named Henry Knox was really Washington's right hand in Boston. Knox had read a lot of military books, had never served even in a militia. But he was smart, he was resourceful, and he came to Washington and said, "General, I think I have a plan and an idea to help you get the British out. Will you let me run with my plan? Will you give me the authority?" And Washington, being a good judge of character, said, "Yeah, go ahead." Henry Knox took a fairly small number of militia. This is before interstate highways, right? In winter, across Massachusetts, across Vermont, to the southern tip of Lake Champlain, to a British outpost called Fort Ticonderoga, which had already been captured by two very famous American revolutionary leaders, Ethan Allen and a guy named Benedict Arnold. Knox's idea was that there was plenty of artillery at Fort Ty. You just had to get it from upstate New York to Boston. Now, if you hop in the car and do this today on the interstate, you're talking about a 6-hour drive. Maybe 7 in winter, because you know what the weather's like up there. Knox and his men literally hauled those cannon across streams, rivers, and mountains and wasteland in ice and snow to Boston. Washington knew just what to do. He had the cannon hauled up onto the Dorchester Heights, which overlooked the Boston Harbor. And the British heard something going on during the night, but they didn't know what was up. And the next morning, they awoke to find dozens of cannon from Fort Ty trained down upon the city and, more importantly, on the harbor where the British warships were. The British warships were formidable weapons, but they couldn't train their guns high enough. And so General Howe simply said, "We have to leave Boston." Without firing a shot, Washington kicked the British Army out of Boston. That went over very well in the colonies, as you might imagine. It was a victory over the most powerful military establishment on the planet. That summer, 1776, in Congress, as the words say on the parchment, the Second Continental Congress took the step. Independence. The American Revolution was already over a year old. It really began on Lexington Green and on Concord Bridge and on the road back to Boston, and after that at Bunker Hill, which of course was really not Breed's Hill. Another victory for the Americans, at least in the eyes of the British. They captured the hill, but they lost more men than most of the officers had ever seen killed and wounded in a battle, even with big European armies. And again, the British officers said, if we're going to win victories like this, we can't win the war. We won't have an army left. When the Declaration was announced, the American military success by that point had been reasonably good, and especially Washington's victory at Boston. But Washington knew what was coming next. He understood military science. He understood tactics and strategy. And the British knew what they were going to do. After dropping some loyalists off in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the British Navy and Army bypassed Boston and descended on New York. Washington marched to New York because he anticipated the move, and he was actually there ahead of them. But he had no navy, and his men were greatly outnumbered. This is a good time to interject some of those macro ideas about what the American Revolution was. Yes, it was a war between the American colonists and Great Britain for American independence. But there were other wars being fought at the same time. Eventually, it evolved into another global war between Britain and all of Britain's enemies. And they had a long list by that point. France, the Netherlands, Spain, everybody who wanted a piece of Great Britain, especially the French. So it was a global war for colonies, for trade, for sea power, for conquest. It was also a war between Americans and Native Americans. That proclamation of 1763 that we talked about wasn't designed just for the sake of being mean to the colonists. It was designed to keep the colonists and the Indians from clashing, because the British knew that if they clashed, the British would have to send troops, and they didn't have the money to do it, so the way to prevent that was to separate the two sides. The colonists, from the beginning, had coveted Indian lands and had taken every occasion to push the Indians back. By treaty, which they broke. By trade, which was always one-sided. By war, whenever the colonists sought to impose military solutions. So the revolution throughout that period of the 1770s and 1780s was also a war between the American colonists and the native peoples of North America, especially those living just west of the Appalachians, particularly in the region around the Ohio River and the Great Lakes. I'm going to be doing part of a TV documentary, or whatever, it may be, movie documentary, I don't know, but it's going to be about the siege of Fort Henry. And essentially, that siege in 1783 was long after the Revolutionary War had been decided. It was essentially part of the ongoing conflict between colonists and Indians. It didn't have much to do at all with the British. Enough of that for now. So it was a war between the colonists and Britain. It was a war between Britain and its European enemies. It was a war between the colonists and the Indians. And it was also a civil war, colonists versus colonists, because while there were patriots, there were also loyalists. We have no good idea of the numbers, but John Adams basically said it was about a third. I'm going to quibble with his numbers a little. I would say that depending on the circumstance locally, because loyalties did change, if your life was in danger or the troops from one side or another were in town, it was probably in the 35 to 40% patriot, 25 to 30% loyalist, and the rest were neutral. How could you be neutral at a time like that? Well, some people are very able. We'll have people who won't vote this year, even though it's a major election year. Some people just don't get involved, don't care, don't want to care. But remember, in this time frame, there were Americans living on small farmsteads and homesteads far removed from towns and villages and the day-to-day commerce that went on along the coast. So if you were living well inland, perhaps the war never even touched you and those around you. And you could potentially be neutral. And many Americans were. That Civil War that went on all over the country, while the Loyalists took their seats on the British ships when they left Boston, that war between Americans was perhaps the most vicious part of the American Revolution. There was plenty of violence between whites and Indians, but between patriots and loyalists, it was about gut feelings. It was about right and wrong. And some of the battles, especially in the South, were fought mostly between colonial forces and loyalist forces. It was divisive in families, in communities, and in each and every colony. Probably the most famous example of what that conflict did was what it meant to Benjamin Franklin, an ardent patriot, whose son, the crown-appointed governor of New Jersey, had a falling out with his father that was never repaired. The Revolution divided families, just like a couple of generations later, the Civil War divided families. So there were a number of wars going on. The most famous of those is the Revolutionary War, as we call it, which was the military conflict. And I'm going to say a few words about that for about another 15 minutes or so, and then give you folks a chance to ask questions. As I said, after Boston, Washington went to New York anticipating a British attack, and it came. But the British outmaneuvered Washington, outnumbered Washington, and their ships alone dominated the area around New York City. You can see here on the inset map where the fighting took place. On Long Island, really Brooklyn and Queens, but part Long Island. And then Harlem Heights and a couple of other places, Fort Lee, White Plains, and essentially Washington was evicted unceremoniously from New York. At that point, some people wanted Washington removed as the head of the Continental Army. They blamed him. Well, he was the boss, so they blamed him, right? It really wasn't Washington's fault. He made a few small tactical errors, but essentially, poor performance by his subordinates, more importantly, the overwhelming military and naval power of Great Britain, pretty well told the tale. I don't know that there was any commander in American history who could have succeeded in that situation where Washington found himself. The odds were clearly stacked against him and his men. And so while some wanted to remove Washington, cooler and smarter heads prevailed, and Washington kept his job. Washington had to retreat from New York, but he didn't just stop at the Hudson River. He retreated all the way across New Jersey. New Jersey was a stronghold of loyalists and support, and Washington had no base there. He finally felt safe when he got across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Now, I dare say that most generals in world history, not just American history, would have gone into winter quarters, as they called it back then, licked his wounds, and written some apologetic letters to Congress, and done a lot of praying. Now, Washington wrote a lot of letters to Congress, but they weren't apologetic. My men haven't been paid. You need to pay them. We don't have food. They need food. Our arms are worn out. We don't have the ammunition. I don't have horses for the officers, let alone shoes for the men. Do your job. Get me what I need to win. Well, Congress didn't listen. But Washington stayed in command. He could have quit. He was one of the wealthiest planters in the country. Anybody here been to Mount Vernon? Wow, I'd go home to that in a minute. He didn't. Washington did something that most generals don't do. Took a risk. Big one. The British had opened the book and done what the book said. Most of the British troops went into winter quarters in New York, but they stationed major detachments, 1,500, 2,000 men, throughout New Jersey to make sure that if Washington left the west bank of the Delaware, that there'd be plenty of time to stop him before he got near New York. Washington knew what was out there, and he knew the British figured he would stay put. His army was beaten. His men were hungry. He was low on everything except disease and cold. Christmas Day, Washington's troops famously crossed the Delaware and attacked the British late in the day on Christmas Day at Trenton. Nobody expected anybody to cross that river when it was full of ice in the middle of winter. Just crossing it was a major military accomplishment. But Washington knew his army. He had guys in that army, led by a colonel named John Glover, who worked every day as fishermen in New England. They went out to the Atlantic Ocean in the winter, so the Delaware River was no big deal. They got the men. They got what few horses they had, and they got their artillery across. It took longer than Washington had planned, but they got it done. And while the plan was a little late, it worked beautifully. Washington's troops surrounded Trenton. Henry Knox was there with his artillery. And the Hessian, which were German mercenaries, detachment of British troops at Trenton was surrounded, mostly captured, many killed or chased away. And Washington won a stunning victory. You've probably all seen pictures of the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? You've all seen that? George Washington standing on the prow of the boat, you know, all 6'3", proud George. I can give you two reasons why that picture is historically inaccurate. Number one, Washington wasn't that stupid to stand up in the boat in the middle of winter crossing the Delaware. And even if he thought he had to give the men some grand gesture, those men loved him. They would have grabbed him by his big, heavy blue coat and politely said, "Gentle sir, sit down," and not let him stand up. I guarantee Washington sat all the way across. That was okay. He did his job. Washington didn't stop there. The British came right after him. The British were good soldiers. These were professionals. They knew their business. British troops closed in on Washington in his positions near Trenton. Washington was in another bind. He had a river to his back. Anybody that served in the military knows you don't want to defend a position with a river to your back because you have nowhere to go. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. There had been a thaw. He was kind of bogged down. But then the ground refroze, and Washington skirted around one British force, went to Princeton and defeated another British force. You don't do that when you're outnumbered and outgunned and tired, which is why he did it. That's what makes him such a great general. Then Washington went to winter quarters at Yorktown. And by then the British had had enough of George Washington for that winter. They never came after him at that point. Washington continued to remain what military scientists call a force in being. He kept that army active through New Jersey and Pennsylvania for the rest of the war. The British held on to New York. Essentially, it was a stalemate in the North. And so the war shifted south. I'm going through this very quickly. I'm oversimplifying. There was one other battle, though, that I want to touch on in the North. And it was one of the most important ones of the Revolution. The Battle of Bemis Farm, otherwise known as Saratoga. John Burgoyne in 1777 came up with a really good plan. He was going to take one army south along Lake Champlain to Albany. Barry St. Ledger was going to take another army across New York through the Finger Lakes area to Albany. And a third British army was supposed to go from New York City up to Albany. Good plan. The British Army in New York only got started when the Battle of Saratoga was over. They didn't help a lot. Barry St. Ledger's army was defeated out here at Oriskany and in other skirmishes by combined forces of colonists, American Continentals, and Native Americans. Native Americans fought on both sides in the American Revolution, and Herkimer and Oriskany were battles where Native American participation was the advantage that the Americans needed to win those battles. One of the heroes of Herkimer Oriskany was the same guy who had led the American forces in their failed effort to capture Montreal. And one of those guys who had helped lead American forces in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, Benedict Arnold. As Burgoyne continued to move south, American forces moved north to meet him near present-day Saratoga, New York, and in a couple of battles, Burgoyne was decisively defeated, and he surrendered thousands of men in his army to the American forces nominally led by Horatio Gates. Things weren't going well on the decisive second day at Bemis Farm. The American troops were being beaten back, and a wounded officer, really disobeying orders, or at least overlooking them, got on his horse, wound and all, charged out there, rallied the American troops, and led them to victory. That victory at Saratoga was a disaster for the British. Burgoyne was one of their best generals, and this wasn't a corporal's guard. This was an army of thousands of men with all kinds of supplies, equipment, weapons, and all the rest. It led to, the next year, a crucial diplomatic success for the Americans. Benjamin Franklin had been working for 2 years in Paris to convince the French king that he needed to support the Americans. A little support was coming, but it was surreptitious. Little money, little power, a little of this, a little of that, stuck in the hold of a ship. It was no big deal. After Saratoga, the French leadership and the king decided, you know what, these Americans might actually do it, and if we're going to get in on the spoils, we better take sides with them right now. So early in 1778, France and the Second Continental Congress signed a Treaty of Alliance, and it was crucial, for those of you who don't like French fries, that alliance was crucial to America's success because the French poured in not just so many supplies, but so much money to support the American Revolution that in 1789 the French government was broke and the French Revolution resulted. Old King Louis lost his head in his country largely because he supported the Americans. I'll bet you can guess who that wounded officer who rallied the Americans in Saratoga was. Come on. Benedict Arnold. When asked who was the best soldier and officer in the Continental Army, George Washington, who knew his business, said, no question, Benedict Arnold. Why did Arnold get such a bad rep? He had a high-maintenance wife. He sold out West Point for the money. Sad story. Ended up with a commission of the British Army, lived out his days in obscurity in England, but Arnold, until he betrayed West Point, was, in Washington's opinion, the best of the best. We're going to shift south very quickly, where Horatio Gates, unfortunately, was given command of American troops because of his reputation from Saratoga, but eventually the Congress understood what Washington had been saying about Gates and Conway and some of these other political hacks who had generals' uniforms. Get rid of them, guys. We can do better. Washington's protege, Nathaniel Greene, understood exactly what Washington needed him to do. Cornwallis, who came ashore in 1780, had a big army, and Cornwallis might have been the best of the British generals. Oh, you ever heard of Nathaniel Greene? He didn't have a reputation. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, he wasn't influential. But he understood, just like Washington, how to win. You fight and you run away. You fight and you run away. And every once in a while you win one, look for a blue star. But most of the time you get beaten, but you get out before you get beaten too badly. And for the better part of 2 years, Greene ran Cornwallis ragged. From Charleston through South Carolina, back down through North Carolina, north in North Carolina into Virginia. Cornwallis, by the fall of 1781, said, oh, man, I guys need a rest. I need a rest. We're going to Yorktown. We're going to spend the winter there. All that time, Washington kept his army outside of New York. The British stayed comfortably in New York. They were protected by rivers, by a loyalist population, by their navy, and a huge army. They probably could have come out and given Washington a hard time, but they didn't really want to tangle with him. They were willing to see what Cornwallis could do with the South, because if the southern colonies gave it up, the war would end. Greene wore Cornwallis down, and he went into Yorktown, which is when the good General George Washington saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. Cornwallis thought he was in a safe haven with a British fleet to his back in the Chesapeake. But Washington had been working for months to get the French to send more than money, more than powder, more than good wishes. Send me a fleet, even if it's for just a few weeks. The French finally agreed, and de Grasse sailed from the West Indies, from the Caribbean, to the Capes off of what is now present-day Virginia Beach. How many of you have been to Virginia Beach? Lots of us, okay. How many of you know that the Battle of the Capes took place within sight of Virginia Beach? If you go to Fort Story, which is the northern end of Virginia Beach, just before it makes the turn into the inlet to Willoughby Spit, where I used to live when I was in the Navy. The Battle of the Capes was a crucial battle in world history. We all know about what happened in Yorktown. Washington closed the trap on Cornwallis. A French fleet was at Cornwallis's back. Washington and Rochambeau's Continental and French armies were in front of him. He was in a sack. A siege which everyone knew was going to be successful for the Americans, led Cornwallis to simply make an early decision and surrender. October 1781, when the British marched out, they played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," because what that was. They had been beaten by an amateur farmer from Virginia and a ragtag bunch of farmers and tradesmen and sailors and ne'er-do-wells that didn't even look like an army. They sure fought like one. The Battle of the Capes forced the British to withdraw from the Chesapeake, and before they could return with enough ships to contest it again, Washington had secretly left just a screen in front of New York with orders to bank the fires high at night and make as much noise as you can in the day to make them think there are 10,000 rather than 1,000 men out there. And he and Rochambeau took their armies, and they managed to do this without Cornwallis finding out about it, all the way from New York City to Yorktown on the Virginia Peninsula south of Washington. And there Washington sprung the trap that led to the surrender of the British in October of 1781. And at that point, there was enough growing opposition from the merchant class, from the members of Parliament who saw the folly in what the British were doing, and British public opinion, to compel Parliament eventually to go to King George, because it had to be the King's decision, and admit that the war was lost. George refused for the longest time. This was the crown jewel of his empire, and he was the one who had to let it go. But eventually, they prevailed upon him. Your Majesty, we can't afford the men. We can't afford the treasure. We can't afford to lose any more colonies to the British and the Dutch and everyone else who's attacking us around the world. Your Majesty, you have to give us permission to negotiate. Which they did, and ultimately, in 1783, the Revolutionary War officially ended when the United States and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Hour and 22 minutes. That's about as fast as I can go and still hit the highlights. questions, comments, rooms, looms, rooms, and little black ducks, as Daffy Duck says in the cartoon.
I alluded to some of the differences in the equipment and battle tactics. Some of the movies and the books indicate that the colonists and our soldiers are not adverse to shooting some of the leaders. I think in the code of chivalry in Europe at that time, you stood there with those muskets which had a range of 100 yards and faced off and shot at each other, whereas the colonists had the long rifles and they could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 150 yards. So they stayed under cover, and they, like you said, they didn't stand march right out against the invading army and slug it out. So that was one thing, the difference in the weaponry, and some of the weapons that evolved in our area were greater than what they had, and this led to even the snipers and some of the other.
You're right. The British unfairly accused the Americans of shooting at their officers. Got news for the British. The British were doing it too. Washington was constantly under fire. Washington. And his coat was shot through many times. He was never hit by a bullet. Neither George Washington nor the great Lakota warrior Crazy Horse was ever touched by a bullet. Washington had horses shot from underneath him, but a bullet never touched George Washington in his life. The British did too. But, well, you know, they say all's fair in love and war, so.
One other question, the British were not used to the swamps and the mosquitoes and some of the illnesses over there. Did they suffer a good deal from that as well? While Green was running them all around through the hill and dale and woods and swamps.
They suffered, but so did the Americans. Washington lost far more men at Valley Forge to disease than he did in any battles with the British. Starvation, deprivation, the elements, disease, all kinds of illnesses attacked soldiers on both sides, not just that war, but in pretty much any war. But yes, that was a factor. Armies were severely debilitated by disease and illness. Yes, sir. The green shirt.
How was the communication? Because, you know, you talk about how they did things. How did they communicate in such timely manner?
Cell phones. No. Okay. No. Communication went as fast as the fastest horse could carry you until you got too tired and you either rested the horse or got another horse. It was that slow. I would take too long to find them down, but some lines on a map that show how long it took news to travel. And even the fastest news took 2 to 3 days to get into the backcountry and many days to get to the far reaches of the colonies, say, out around the Great Lakes or into the Ohio Valley or near the Mississippi. It was strictly by horse speed, just like it was in the time of Julius Caesar. Telegraph didn't come around until 1844. John.
Two questions. One, the term all men are created equal, in my opinion, is a falsehood. What was the sense that they used it in the Declaration of Independence? Secondly, where was Canada in all this independence and revolutionary idea?
All men are created equal meant all white men were created equal. To be blunt about it, that's what it meant. They didn't include women, they didn't include people of color, not Africans, not Indians, not anyone other than white, and then you still had to be born to the right station. Oh, but it sure did sound good, and look where it's gotten us. You know, now, in this country, all men and women are equal before the law and in the eyes of most Americans. It was a very lofty idea, and it wasn't Jefferson's alone, but it was prevalent in the political and humanistic writings of the European Enlightenment, which went back 150 years before the Revolution. It was part and parcel of what educated, thinking people were contemplating about their state of affairs. As far as Canada, as the Americans called it back then, I mentioned Benedict Arnold. One of the first things Congress did in 1775, before declaring independence, was mount an attack on Canada. That attack led by Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery was woefully undermanned. Disease, weather, and other things undermined them, and so they failed. Not because they were bad, it's just the odds were against them. Canada was asked to join the First and Second Continental Congresses to send troops to the Continental Army, but most Canadians wanted to remain part of the British Empire. They saw the avarice, the land-hungry character, and frankly the violent tendencies of these American colonies to be very different than their attitude, their culture toward the Indians and toward commerce. So Canada remained a target, as it was during the War of 1812 as well for the Americans, but it's taken until the 20th and 21st century. Any Canadians here, before I say the wrong thing? Before Canada became an economic colony of the United States, but it's still an independent country, and the Canadians are really wonderful people. The Americans wanted it big time. They considered Canada to be one of the North American colonies. We say 13, but they would have increased it well into the teens and maybe into the 20s if other people had been so like-minded. But they made every good effort to capture it and didn't give up on the idea. In fact, to give you an idea of how serious this issue was, the British General Staff maintained specific, revised plans on a regular basis to defend Canada from an attack by the United States until 1898. Too bad. Okay, so, and the green shirt again. Green shirts are asking the questions tonight.
What did we, the people, who was behind that, really mean?
Okay. Well, the Constitution, I take it literally. If you diagram the sentence, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, yada, yada, yada. We the people of the United States. The subject of the sentence is we the people of the United States is an irrelevant, discardable prepositional phrase. It simply describes those people. The founders, the framers, whatever name you want to give them, were conscious of what they were doing and they were looking ahead. They didn't say we the states. They didn't say we the legislatures. They didn't say we the rich white men. They said, we the people. There was a reason for that. Because they really understood the enormity and the revolutionary nature of what they had done in seeking and gaining their independence. These people understood world history. They understood philosophy. They understood political science. And if they were in the room right now, they would say, we weren't surprised. We understood the implications of what we were doing. We didn't know how it was going to turn out. But we wanted to create a roadmap. And even though it wasn't true at the time, all men are created equal, has come true. And even though it wasn't true at the time, we the people, as opposed to we the something else, has come true as well. It was a very conscious effort on their part. Controversial, but that's how you vote things in the democracy, and it passed. The preamble of the Constitution. Yes, sir.
Could the war have been won without the help of the French?
IMO? No. You can text that one real fast. In my opinion, no. French aid was crucial. The colonists couldn't produce enough of the war materials essential to keep Washington's army going. Yeah, they could make shoes and uniforms. Guns, shot, powder, and the conveyance to get it to the Americas, and the money to pay for it. One of the reasons Washington was constantly pressuring Congress to pay his men was because Congress didn't have any money and couldn't do it anyway. Washington kept the heat on. Congress could only ask the states to contribute money. The government under the Articles had no power of taxation. And so consequently, the states figured, well, the danger's close enough, I guess we could chip in a little. But hey, I'm up here in Vermont, the Army's down there in New York or South Carolina, so I'm not going to pay. Yeah, we're like that. So the French aid was absolutely crucial, and I don't know if you'll find a serious historian anywhere in the world who would say that it was incidental and meaningless. It was vital, it was crucial, and without it, it sure wouldn't have been success as quickly as it came. It might have taken a generation or more, and God knows how many dead Americans and others in order to do it. How much time we have? Maybe one more question? Is anybody else? If not, I'll come back to this gentleman. Anybody else? Going once, going twice? Okay, your shot.
Well, questions on Washington, is it true that he actually executed some deserters to keep the army?
Yeah, Washington did.
Valley Forge or thereabouts?
Yeah, it was after Valley Forge. There was a mutiny, as it turned out. And Washington initially had all the perpetrators rounded up and was well within his rights, by custom and by law, to have them all executed for mutiny. But this was George Washington. You know what he did? He had the officers shot. And he let the enlisted men re-enter or go home. Rather than create a bigger problem by executing dozens and dozens, he just took the ringleaders and had them tried by a military court, and they were duly executed. You know, that's kind of like Solomon getting ready to cut the baby in half. It's tough love, but Washington had a feel for that army and for the country. He's the only man in American history who was offered the opportunity to be king of the United States. And on more than one occasion, he said no. Thank you.